The story of foreign aid isn't just about development, it's about dividends. Every loan came with strings attached. These weren't just economic arrangements, they were geopolitical contracts. During the Cold War, debt was Washington's silent weapon. It kept countries in America's orbit without firing a shot. Votes to the United Nations, say, shifted not by persuasion but by obligation. In 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, many governments reliant on US aid quietly backed Washington to avoid financial retaliation. Egypt is a classic case. Once a close ally of the Soviet Union, Egypt pivoted after the Camp David Accord of 1978 to 79. In exchange for peace with Israel, Cairo received billions in US aid and debt restructuring, cementing not just peace, but Egypt's long-term place in Washington's camp. Greetings, I'm Dr. Chrissy Agawu. Welcome to the last episode on the John Perkins Economic Hitman. Today we're diving into the US dividend. Who benefited? From Cold War geopolitics to corporate windfalls and dollar supremacy, we'll uncover how debt abroad translated into prosperity at home. Now, if you find these conversations valuable, don't forget to subscribe and stay with me for more insights. John Perkins was a professional economic hitman whose task was to convince developing countries to accept massive loans for overpriced infrastructure projects they often didn't need. These projects were designed less to foster development than to enrich US corporations and lock nations into debt. Perkins saw this pattern firsthand, and in many cases, he was the one implementing it. He later revealed how leaders who resisted often paid the price. In Panama, Omar Torrijos resisted US control and died in a mysterious plane crash. In Ecuador, Jaime Roldós challenged oil interests and met the same fate. Both leaders refused the debt for compliance bargain. Others, like Suharto in Indonesia, embraced it, taking billions in loans while US firms gained privileged access to oil, timber, and minerals. Even geography bent under the weight of debt. The Philippines under Marcos and Panama under Noriega didn't host US bases out of goodwill, but because loans and debt relief left their governments with no real choice. When China's rise began to worry Washington, the playbook was reused. African and Latin American leaders were warned. Lean too far toward Beijing and your IMF negotiations might stall. Align with Washington and your credit line stayed open. That became the invisible empire, not conquest with armies, but compliance enforced through credit. The World Bank and IMF lent billions to developing nations. Yes, dams, highways, and power plants were built, but at inflated prices and on terms that favored foreign corporations. John Perkins put it bluntly, the money never left the United States. The loans cycled back into the US banks and companies while host nations were left servicing debts for larger than the real value of what they received. Here's how it worked. A country like Ecuador signed a loan, deposited in a US bank. Contracts went to American giants, Bechtel, Halliburton, Brown and Root, Stone and Webster, and Parsons. They built dams, pipelines, highways. Profits flowed home. American jobs were created, and the host country left with bloated debt. In Ecuador, World Bank loans were justified by oil wealth. Texaco and US contractors profited from pipelines and refineries. Meanwhile, Ecuador's debt exploded from $240 million in 1970 to $16 billion by 2000. Most Ecuadorians never saw the benefits, but Washington and Wall Street did. Indonesia tells the same story. In the 1970s, it was showered with over $400 million in loans for giant power projects. Much of it channeled to US firms like Bechtel and Stone and Webster. By the early 1980s, external debt had ballooned from $2.1 billion to over $30 billion. As Perkins put it, Indonesia's new glow was bought at the price of dependency. The formula was simple. For the global south, debt and austerity. For America, contracts, profits, and influence. This was the dividend, a system where public loans abroad became private windfalls at home. Now, multiply this across dozens of countries, and the pattern is clear. Loans labeled as development often developed America more than they did the borrowing nations. Contracts were routinely inflated, projects overpriced, and benefits skewed toward elites. Dams and pipelines may have stood in the foreign soil, but the real gains showed up in the US corporate earnings, Wall Street ledgers, and American suburbs, while host nations carried the debts and were ultimately left worse off, according to John Perkins. And one has to ask, what kind of development is this? It's no wonder that in her book, Dead Aid, Dambisa Moyo bristled at the system and urged African countries to break free from aid. And as for Dr. Arikana Chihambori Kwao, she doesn't mince her words. Aid was the new chain, debt the slavery, she argues. But that was only half the story. Beyond corporate profits, every deal also reinforced Washington's grip on global finance because the loans were in dollars. You see, that meant that every contract strengthened the greenback's role as the world's reserve currency. Countries needed dollars not only to service debt, but also to buy oil and other essential commodities. The result? A constant built-in demand for US dollars, which quietly cemented America's financial dominance. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just economics. The financial leverage carried straight into politics. These outstanding loans became bargaining chips. If Washington wanted votes at the United Nations, a new trade deal, or even permission to set up a military base, officials would gently remind leaders, your financial survival depends on our goodwill. Development aid became, in effect, a velvet-gloved instrument of coercion. In 2018, Ghana signed a defense cooperation agreement granting U.S. forces sweeping privileges, tax exemptions, free access to facilities, even immunity from prosecution. Kwesi Pratt Jr., a veteran journalist and editor of the Insight newspaper, blasted it as a sellout of Ghana's sovereignty, nothing short of surrender. He warned that no independent nation should hand over such unfathomable rights to foreign troops. It was a vivid example of how debt and dependency could bend not just economics, but even the very question of who controls national soil. And it wasn't just about Ghana. Washington's leverage over nations rests ultimately on the power of the dollar itself. When the US abandoned the gold standard in 1971, Washington struck new bargains to keep the dollar on top. Chief among them was the petrodollar system of the 1970s. Saudi Arabia and later OPEC agreed to sell oil only in US dollars. In return, they received military protection, weapons deals, and access to American financial markets to recycle oil profits. It wasn't just a monetary arrangement, it was a geopolitical contract. Oil for dollars, dollars for security. For developing nations, the story was brutal. It translated into borrowing in dollars, earning in commodities, and repaying in dollars. Whenever the dollar strengthened, the debt burdens swelled. Washington profited twice. First, from inflated contracts for its corporations, and second, the world's structural dependence on its currency. By the 1990s, over 60% of global reserves were held in dollars, locking much of the world into America's monetary orbit. That, my friends, was the quiet genius of the economic Hitman model. It wasn't just about shady contracts or big loans. It was about anchoring the global economy itself to one throne, the US dollar. Debt also opened doors to resources. Now, let's be clear. Debt itself is not the villain. Countries borrow to build grids, schools, hospitals, roads. But when loans are overpriced, tilted toward dependency, or tied to lopsided conditions, they stop being engines of development and become chains of dependency. Here's what often happened. A country owed billions it couldn't repay while sitting on oil, copper, cobalt, bauxite, and timber. Loans then came with strings. Open your markets, give foreign companies access, sign away concessions. The result? American industries secured cheap raw materials. US consumers enjoyed low prices on cars, electronics, and gasoline. The prosperity of suburban America, highways, malls, air-conditioned homes, was subsidized by debts abroad. In his 2016 edition of his book, John Perkins warned that the targets had shifted. Resources now included privatized water, electricity, telecom, even data. Economic hitmen no longer focused only on minerals, but on the everyday bills of the poor. For the US, the dividend was steady supply chains and cheap inputs. For the global South, it was depleted lands, privatized services, and debts that never disappeared. According to John Perkins, in the end, the debt of others became America's dividend. Corporations grew richer. Shareholders prospered. Millions of American jobs were created. The dollar reigned supreme. The American dream thrived on low prices, cheap credit, and abundant goods. But the cost was paid elsewhere. In Ecuador, in Bolivia, across Africa, billions meant for development flowed to creditors. The pattern only evolved: privatization, trade deals, consultants enforcing austerity. Prosperity for some meant dependency for others. The truth is stark. America's middle class flourished, while communities in the global South carried debts, crumbling schools, and deferred dreams. This was the US dividend: prosperity at home paid for by dependency abroad, according to John Perkins. So people, that's the story of the US dividend, a system where debt, resources, and currency enriched Washington and American corporations, while leaving much of the global South trapped in cycles of austerity. But that's not the whole story. It cannot be. African leaders cannot be left off the hook. Too often, African public officials played along through naivete, poor strategy, or outright corruption. They have stolen, they have looted, and they have bled their own nations dry. That's where we'll turn next. Now, if this episode gave you a new perspective, please like, share, and comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next deep dive. Thank you for watching and for being part of this conversation. Until next time, this is Dr. Chrissy Akau, thanking you for joining me.